This is one of my favourite seams to do on a piece of crochet. I'll be working both with the pieces horizontally, so that I'll be working into the sides of the stitches, and I'll also be putting the stitch heads together and crocheting into those as well. So we'll see a good comparison between the two of them. So I'm going to start with a slip stitch, and the particular type of seam that I'm going to do is a slip stitch seam with a crochet hook, and I'll be working into the back loops. So this is a decorative seam. The crochet slip stitch will sit in between the back loops of the two pieces. So I'm going to start off by working it into the back loops here, and then I'll work it into the sides of the piece as well. So I'm going to start just joining it in the corner here. A little bit fiddly to get into the first stitch. I did actually wash and block this, and the yarn has gone slightly fluffy, but I think it should still work out okay. So those are the back loops there. I'm just going to tension the yarn in my hand, and then I'm going to work through. Now this seam can look slightly different depending on whether you go into, depending on which side you go into first. It also feels quite different to work. I like to have the piece that's further away from me as the first loop I go through, and the piece that's nearer to me as the second loop I work into. I just find that a lot easier, not to get tangled up as I'm pulling both through. The first stitch is a little bit tight, so I think I've fluffed that one slightly. Let's get that there. Once it's secured, it works up a lot more easily. So I'll be working into the back loop of the next stitch, into one side, into the other side, and then simply pulling the seaming yarn through both of those. In a few stitches I'll show the result. Into the first side, into the second side, and pull the yarn through both of those. So you can see this is quite a highly decorative seam. It could look really nice actually as a contrast edging, perhaps along the shoulder of a crocheted top or similar, and this would be a really nice way to join that and make a feature of the edge of the join, rather than it being something that you want to hide or have completely invisible. And I think that's quite different often in crochet to knitting, is we actually like our joins to be visible, particularly when joining blankets. I think it's very popular to have a visible join rather than a border around blanket squares, for example. It brings the whole piece into harmony. Slightly tight stitch there. I probably should have hand washed it before blocking the piece rather than machine washing it, but I was a little bit lazy. So we'll work all across this, and then I'll work down the side as well. I find that if I work first of all into the front stitch and then into the back stitch, just as a comparison, because some people think this is a very fiddly seam, and I think that's what they're doing. It's actually really hard. Pretty much the hook always locks and I can hardly get it through, so I've found that doing it the other way around works a lot better. If you do need to do it that way around, then you almost need to do it as in two stages. Of course this stitch is now going to jam on me there because I've pulled it a little bit tight, demonstrating what not to do. So you can see I've got almost to the end of this, and using those high contrast yarns has worked really well for the visibility of it there. And so that's the piece joined. Even though I've gone down a hook size, it still hasn't changed the width of the crochet there. If I'd gone down another size, it might have been a little bit tight. One thing that it does do is give a lot of stability to the piece of work. There's still some stretch and flexibility there, but if you were using that for your shoulder, you wouldn't find that those pieces are going to droop they're not easily going to pull apart either. It feels a lot like crochet, but it has given some stability there, and that can be a really strong reason for working a seamed garment over a seamless garment, particularly when you're working in a heavy yarn like cotton. So I'm just going to finish off that last stitch in the corner there. This one is, the stitches are not exactly the right position because one of them's not actually a crochet stitch, it's the rising chains from one side of the piece. So there we go. So I'm going to cut that there, and then I'm going to work separately along the side. The sides, of course, is a lot more difficult to do, and lots of crocheters do get nervous about joining at the sides. So if we imagine that this was perhaps a top that we're working, or a child's dress, we've now worked along the shoulder, perhaps there where the heads of the stitches are, and we're now going to sew down the sides of the dress from the underarm, perhaps down the side, and the stitches look very different there. There's no obvious place for you to work into like there is with the heads of the stitches, that each stitch has a double loop, and also because your chains will be going in the opposite direction. Each chain is about the same size as a stitch head, but it doesn't necessarily match up perfectly with the number of stitches you've got. These stitches are UK trebles or US double crochets, and so I tend to find they need between 2 or 3, and that can depend a lot on the yarn, the size of the hook you've used, etc. So I'm not actually sure how many they'll need, but you have to be prepared to test it out as you go along, and see what works best for it. So sometimes you might have to work 3 stitches in one, and then 2 in the next one, 3 in one, and 2 in the next, and so on, all the way along. You'll find a pattern that works well for you. You might also find that you want to go up a hook size or down a hook size to maintain the same tension as the stitches. So let's have a look at this now. This is going to be a little bit more difficult to do, that's why I've broken the yarn. When I've done my other seams, I've normally taken the first seam out before doing the other one, but that obviously takes a little while. So I'm going to do a slip stitch again. And the most important thing really when working this stitch is to look and take just one thread, and again take it from the piece that's further away from you, and then try and pick up one thread. You can see where I've woven in my ends there. Some of them are frayed a little bit. Let's trim them to make it a bit easier. That's it. And then I'm going to work into there. So I'm doing exactly the same thing, but I'm just finding a loop at a time through each of the stitches. And again, take a loop somewhere towards the edge and in a similar place on the other side. If you end up taking it through 2 loops at the same time, it can make the piece of work a little bit stiff. It's not a disaster if that happens. It can just feel a little bit stiff and thick and bumpy, the seam that you're working into. And so then I'm going to continue with that all the way along. And I'll be looking as I go along just to see, is my is my seam tighter than the work? Is it pulling it into gathers or making it pucker? Or is it a little bit too loose, in which case the crochet chains are looking like they've got little loops on them and that they could catch easily. So taking a little piece from each side, finding something on the other side that I can work into that's on the edge. Always making sure it's just the one loop. And so you can see this will actually shape up the edge quite nicely. Oh, I haven't gone completely through, I've split the stitch there. Yeah, that definitely teaches me a lesson not to machine wash my crochet pieces before blocking them. Always do it by hand. These stitches are so fluffy now. There we go. That's a good loop to get into, work into. You might find with this that it works better if you have got awkward stitches to work into, or you're working with quite a tight tension, to use a Tunisian hook for this. If you have a Tunisian hook, you'll notice that they're often slightly sharper with a more pointed end. I've got one here than a regular crochet hook. You can see this one's quite rounded, and the Tunisian hook is much pointier, and it definitely gets more easily between the stitches. But I don't actually have one in 4mm, so it's not one that I'm going to be able to use. I think if I've only got a 5 and I think a 3.5, and I think those are too far either side of the original size I used for the piece, 4.5mm. Longer piece or a piece that was going to be a real garment, I would probably have pinned this before I started, possibly using safety pins or possibly using stitch markers. I've got these ones that are something like a cross between a stitch marker and a safety pin, and they're actually really good for joining two pieces and making sure the bits stay at a similar level. Otherwise you might find that you've stretched the front piece a little bit more than the back piece, and so it's not looking very even. You end up with a lot of front left. And so there we go, that's the second seam. So we have the seam along the stitch heads that sits between them, forming perhaps a decorative shoulder join, and then we've got this seam that would perhaps be the underarm to waist seam, and you can see it keeps a very nice straight line where you had quite a wiggly line originally between the two pieces. You had that kind of end there, edge there,